Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Today we will be discussing unusual verbs known as Gustar, or verbs like Gustar, and reflexive verbs. Verbs like Gustar, you may hear them referred to as different verbs as well. And reflexive verbs are not different verbs, and they're not like Gustar, and we will talk about that as we go through. My name is Dan, and my colleague Zach is here to answer any questions you may have throughout or at the end of the webinar, so please send them in at any time. And at any time throughout your coursework, if you need any help from us, feel free to contact us at the ways you see on your slide right now. We're always here and happy to help you get through your course and do as well as you can. You can send in your questions here, as you see on the slide at the bottom of the screen. And in just one moment, we'll get started. So today's objectives. Today we're going to identify different verbs that are formed like Gustar, explain normal versus different verbs or verbs like Gustar, describe the 5 steps to forming Gustar sentences, and explain and go in depth on reflexive verbs. We're going to begin with verbs like Gustar. On this slide, we just look at some examples of verbs that are similar to Gustar and follow the rules that we're going to lay out here in a moment. So you have 6 main quote-unquote different verbs or verbs like Gustar, starting with Gustar all the way down to doler. All right, so one thing about these is that their definitions literally come across a little bit unusual, and they end with the word to. So a verb like Gustar, as you see in number 1, translates literally in English as to be pleasing to. More commonly, we might say the verb means to like. All the verb conjugations are preceded by a few things: a prepositional phrase, meaning a preposition and a pronoun. There's an example of that, which we'll get into here in a little bit more depth in a few slides. An agreeing indirect object pronoun. So A and B must agree, which we'll talk about. And then the subject, which isn't always going to be a person, comes at the end of the sentence, which is unusual or different. And it must agree with the different verb conjugation that it follows. And for the purpose of this webinar and for most of what you'll see different verbs related in your course, we're going to focus on the third singular and third plural present indicative tense forms of these verbs only. So in order to form a sentence that includes a different verb or a verb like Gustar, you would start by inserting a preposition, a most commonly, meaning to, to, or less commonly seen, the preposition para, meaning for. And as you'll see in the next 2 steps, the a, to, to, and para, for, for, are important as they take on some of the usage of steps 2 and 3 with indirect objects and indirect object pronouns. As you might know, indirect objects answer to whom or for whom an action is happening. So that second step, the prepositional pronoun, will be chosen based on to or for whom this action is actually occurring. Step 3 will be an agreeing indirect object pronoun. As I said, steps 2 and 3 agree. They're based off of one another. And then steps 4 and 5 will agree, 4 being the conjugation that we mentioned on the previous slide, either a third singular or third plural present indicative form, ending in either a or a for the singular forms, on or n for the plural forms. A and on representing AR verbs, a and n representing ER/IR verbs. And finally, you would insert the subject or subjects agreeing with step 4, and we're going to dive into that in a little bit more detail on how to choose and how to form those steps one by one. Okay, for step 5, all right, the subjects are always going to be known as the triggers. Okay, the triggers are the things that help you determine step 4, the conjugation of the different verb. So in order for the different verb, like gustar, doler, interessar that we saw on the earlier slide, the list of verbs, in order for those verbs to be conjugated singularly ending in a or e, you must have either a singular noun as step 5, the subject, or any number, any amount of infinitive verbs. Could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 20. But even if there is a plural noun following the infinitive verb, that still triggers third singular. And we're going to show you all that in some examples to make it a little bit clearer as we move forward here in a few moments. Okay, and then the only trigger that would force you to use third plural, either the an, or the en, the n forms of the verbs, the different verbs, would be a plural noun. So again, we'll show you some examples of how that comes about in the next couple slides. So let's start with a few examples. All right, the first one, a, me, and may, they agree. That would be the me and the may, steps 2 and 3. And since escribir is the subject here, gusta is singular. So literally, writing novels, the writing component of that is the subject. It is what is pleasing to me. I am the object here. I am the recipient of the verb's action. Okay, so we show you the literal translation in A, and we show you the more commonly used English translation in B for each of these. In example 2, the word pies, P-I-E-S, means feet. Since feet are plural, duelen has to be plural. And since he is the recipient, el, then lay is the agreeing object pronoun with el. Both of those are third person singular. And for that last example, all right, the noun matematica, the subject itself, math, is not interesting to the students. Since matematica is a singular noun, it is the trigger for interesa to be singular. And since it's not interesting to them, the students, plural people, les is plural to agree with the students. So if you were to compare the previous slide with this slide and the next, you'll see how basically the second word, me, el, or los estudiantes in this case, always agrees with what comes next, the indirect object pronoun. And then more often than not, the last word, novelas, but in that case, escribir, pies, matematica, those are the triggers, the subjects determining the number of the conjugation, third singular or third plural. So you can kind of put 2 and 2 together there. Just a few more examples. In example 4, all right, we show you how, or one more example rather, we show you how even though there are multiple infinitives, hacer tarea, estudiar, and leer, doing homework, studying, and reading, even though there's multiple infinitives, molesta has to be singular. Since it's not a plural noun acting as the subject, the verb has to still be in singular, not plural form. And since it's being done to or is bothersome to Pablo, like saying to him, le agrees with Pablo, both of those, third singular again. Okay, so that's a lot of information, in a couple of slides. So definitely something to go back and review and take your time with, as you will see it come up in your program. And if you do have additional questions about that or any other topic, always good to reach out to us so we can give you some further instruction on that. We know some of these are difficult topics to kind of, go at on your own. Okay, for now though, we're going to transition from our discussion on different verbs to our discussion on reflexive verbs. And as a reminder, as I mentioned earlier, all right, reflexive verbs are a type of quote-unquote normal verb, meaning they do not follow the rules that we just discussed for different verbs or verbs like Gustar. Okay, they follow more of an active voice setup where you have a subject followed by a verb followed by an object. The difference between reflexive verbs and non-reflexive verbs is that reflexive verbs require a reflexive pronoun before their conjugation. And we're going to talk about them on the next slide. Most reflexive verbs, think about an action that reflects, okay, something that is done to oneself. And in their most basic form, in their dictionary kind of form, their infinitive form, they always end with the pronoun se, as you can see an example on the bottom of the slide. Levantarse means to get up, as if somebody was lifting themselves up off of a chair, out of bed, off the floor, etc. Think about levitating. That's a bit of a root word for that verb. Okay, so on this slide, you'll see the actual reflexive pronouns that are needed. As it says down below, me, te, se, nos, or se, they don't have a translation. They don't really translate literally, but they must precede, meaning they must come before the conjugated verb form for any reflexive verb, as I mentioned on the previous slide. And these pronouns, since they're set up in a chart, always relate back to a particular person. So if I was the subject, if I said I don't know, take a shower every night at a certain time, it would be yo followed by me. But if they take a shower, at different times than I do, then se, bottom right. Okay, so the pronoun here that you choose has to agree with the subject of the sentence. And then the verb's ending obviously must agree with both of those things as well. Okay, just a couple different types of reflexive verbs or categories. The first we'll refer to as the standard reflexive verb. Most of them have to do with personal hygiene, taking care of oneself. Okay, there are things that you can do to yourself. Brushing your teeth, shaving, combing your hair, washing your face, your hands, etc. A second common type would be those that have a definition change. When you compare the reflexive verb versus its non-reflexive form, there's a different context that comes about. You'll see some examples of that. For instance, the verb ir means to go. It has a reflexive counterpart, irse, which means to leave. So slightly different meaning, slightly different context. Not all reflexive verbs have a non-reflexive form and vice versa. And then finally, the third most common type is the type called reflexive by nature. And these verbs are just simply conjugated reflexively. They have nothing to do with being done to oneself, and they don't really have any definition change. They're just verbs that have to have reflexive pronouns preceding their conjugations just because. No real explanation for it. Okay, so those are the three most common types. And on this slide, you see a whole bunch of very good examples that will come up throughout your program, throughout your course with us. On the left, you have your standard hygiene-related verbs. As you can tell, those are basically all things you can do to yourself. All right. Others could do to them to you as well, but they wouldn't be reflexive in that case. In the middle, you have your definition changes, and you can go through them. And finally, on the right side, you have your examples of reflexive by nature. Okay, so I'll leave that up there just for another moment. Just show you on the left, you have your hygiene or standard examples. Your middle has your definition change examples. And on the right, your by nature examples. Okay, as we move forward, we'll talk about some example sentences for each of these types, starting with the verb maquillarse, to put on makeup. Notice how Maria is the subject, so it's like saying she does this every morning. Se agrees with Maria. Okay, and each of these examples are going to change and the tense will vary. Okay, the second example, I am the subject, and you can tell that even though the pronoun yo is not there, may is the reflexive pronoun, the only one for first person singular. And this is a preterite example, past tense. The E with an accent tells you that it's first person singular preterite as well. So if you can imagine the word yo before that may, they would agree. And then nos always represents first person plural, as does that amos ending. Imagine the word nosotros at the beginning as the subject. They would, or it would agree with nos, first person plural. We will brush our teeth soon. So you have a present example in A, a preterite example in B, and a future tense example in C. All of them conjugated with the pronoun preceding them. If you were to take out that say, that may, or that nos, they would no longer be reflexive. They would be non-reflexive, maybe things you can do to somebody else. If she was putting makeup on another person to help a friend, let's say. Okay, in that case, the say would not be necessary. Here you have a few examples of definition change reflexive verb. The verb dormirse, which means to fall asleep in number 1, versus its non-reflexive form, dormir, which is to sleep. You have to fall asleep before you can sleep for any amount of time. That's that process of getting put into that state of sleep. So the first one, reflexive, its meaning is a little bit different and its context is a little bit different than the second one, where it's not reflexive and the pronoun makes a big difference in determining the context and the actual translation of each of those sentences. So he falls asleep at 11 every night, but then he sleeps for 8 hours each night. So that's one group of examples for definition changes, and here's a second. Ir and irse are the verbs used here. Irse at the top, ir on the bottom. Irse at the top meaning to leave when irse is reflexive. Okay, it has a slightly different meaning, a slightly different context than ir when it's not reflexive, as you can see in the translations. They left at midnight. The say, the reflexive pronoun, is necessary. But they went to the bank. They didn't leave the bank. Okay, they went to the bank, saying like they arrived there. That's non-reflexive, and the pronoun is not necessary in that case. So the definition change is shown, all right, and how they appear reflexively or not. And finally, an example of a reflexive by nature sentence. The verb desayunarse means to eat breakfast or to have breakfast. And the verb darse cuenta de means to realize. So we have two by nature verbs here. Verbs that just have to be reflexive. They're not anything you're doing to yourself. They don't really have a definition change, as we mentioned when we introduced the different types on a few slides back. These are just reflexive just because, basically. They have to have reflexive pronouns with their conjugations. So they were eating breakfast when they realized they were late for work. The first verb is in the imperfect. It was ongoing. The second, preterite, because you had that moment where you realized, oh no, it's late, I'm late, got to get going. But each is reflexive. Each needs a pronoun before its conjugation. And since they are the subjects throughout the entire sentence, say agrees with they in both verbs. And to wrap up our webinar today, we will discuss the last part of reflexive verbs known as plural reflexives. A plural reflexive is used to express reciprocal actions, something that can be done to and for, one person and to and for the other, to reciprocate something, or to express mutual feelings. In this case, a typically non-reflexive verb, as you can see there are 8 examples of these on the bottom of the slide, a non-reflexive verb is formed or forced to be reflexive. And they basically translate as these actions being done or shared to or among one another or each other. So if you were to say something like ayudar, he and I help each other, you would force ayudar to sort of turn into ayudarse, conjugated accordingly, which we'll show on the next slide. and that is expressing a reciprocal action. As opposed to saying something like the verb respetar, he and I respect one another. Right? If I was to say something like I respect him, but he doesn't respect me, that's not reflexive, that's not mutual. I help him, but he doesn't help me. Again, not reflexive, not reciprocal. Both people have to be on the same page in order for these verbs to be forced or made reflexive. And here's an example using ayudar, which we saw in the previous slide. It means to help. In the future tense here, Juan and Jorge will help each other with the project. Juan is going to help Jorge, and vice versa, Jorge will help Juan. If that just simply said Juan is going to help Jorge with Jorge's project, the end, Jorge's not going to help Juan with his, then it would not be reflexive. But this is a reciprocal action that each will help the other with. Again, since it is still reflexive, the pronoun must agree with the subjects. They are the subjects here, the two boys. So say, third plural, reflexive pronoun agrees with Juan y Jorge. And our last example to show a mutual feeling, using amar, to love, forcing it to be reflexive when the husband and his wife mutually love each other. All right, they love each other a lot. Then amar is made to be reflexive. Again, since the subjects are third plural, he and she, they, say would agree with those two people in third person plural. So again, it's reflexive. The pronoun has to be there. If only one person loved the other, it would not be a reciprocal action or a mutual feeling, and no need for a reflexive pronoun or conjugation in that context. So that concludes today's webinar. We thank you for your attention. We do ask if you have any questions, you can send them in at this time or follow up with us at any point throughout your coursework. We would be happy to help you, get through the course and do the best you can. Zach and I wish you buena suerte, good luck in Spanish, and if you do need us, feel free to reach us in all these possible ways. Thank you and have a good day.